Hey everyone, welcome into Dom Time with Dom Giordano. You may look on your screen and you may see the iconic symbol to me, the national debt clock. Those numbers are very real. One of our guests tonight, Dan Fatton, who's worked for the Obama campaign and works for New Jersey Future, doesn't see them as frightening as some might see them. Our other guest, Ryan Shinnecki, has not had a chance to kind of weigh in on that. Are these frightening or are these manageable in your view?
Well, I think they're frightening, and they're frightening for the fact that, you have to really look at it as a holistically, right? You can't just look at it as, is it just taxes? Is it just health care? Is it just Social Security? I mean, all these pieces together are drivers of increasing spending over time. Eventually what will happen is we'll run into a situation where we can't borrow as freely as we can. We can't borrow at the low interest rates. And so I think if you're younger, if you're a millennial, you should start to look at how pieces like health care, how defense, how these pieces, how they're creeping up as a percentage of the overall budget, and think about it as a crowding out effect for all the other programs that you might want to see the government invest in. I mean, if you're worried about infrastructure, if you're worried about education, if you're worried about the poor, all these programs are going to start to take hits and you see less spending over time because we're increasing our spending in other parts of the budget.
Dan, let's focus in on one. I think everybody of college age, or some of them are on set with us here at Dom Time, and they said, $26,000 they have in college debt. We've had guests on that have ranged to $100,000 in college debt. What do you think is the driver of that cost, that high cost of college, and what should be done about it?
Well, I think it's a host of issues that are driving the cost of college, and it ranges anything from the underinvestment in higher education from state and federal government to I'm not necessarily an expert on student loan financing, but I think the president actually did do a great job in making sure that student interest rates didn't skyrocket over the last end of his term there.
Right.
And I think the Student Loan Forgiveness Act is a
should it be
good step
forgiven?
For them to take.
Tell viewers of the Dom Giordano program, would you student loan and how much of it should be forgiven? These kids have rung up this way, you go off, my sin and sin no more. You don't have any more student loan debt.
Well, I think there's been some analysis that shows that if you were to forgive some of that student debt, you could actually, it could be a kickstarter to the economy, and you get a lot of discretionary income that gets put into the economy. It's additional spending money for students to spend on things like rent or groceries or starting their own business.
Now that's appealing, and Romney, maybe sour grapes made the case. He said that's what the president did. He gave this vague signal to millennials, I will forgive this at some point in the future. That's what we're looking for. To me, that's a complete nonsense. What would that teach people if they ring up a debt and then somebody's going to forgive
Well,
it?
look, in a lot of civilized countries around the world, education is free. And so the fact that we have students who have to take out $100,000 in order to get a higher education is really an affront to being a civilized nation. And I think that, speaking of affronts, I think that Romney's statements about gifts to minorities and to women and to whomever he thought got gifts was really offensive. And that's probably partly why he was rejected as a candidate for the presidency.
Well, it was sour grapes, but was it accurate? Don't you think the Obama administration was promising more than Romney was promising, particularly to young people? The one that we mentioned, college loan forgiveness?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. What was he promising? He was promising a continued job growth. He was promising not to repeal Obamacare, which took off the table, kicking people out of health insurance for pre-existing conditions and allowed kids who are up to 26 to stay on their parents' policies. So if you think of those as gifts rather than legitimate policy wins, then sure, he was giving gifts.
Obamacare, and you guys now, for listeners, they know the magic names Simpson and Bowles. These two guys who are sort of long past out of Washington actively, but you sought them out. They sit on your executive board. What do you say about Obamacare? What does the Can Kicks Back say about Obamacare, about the president's health care plan?
Yeah, well, I think that there's certainly some good things in Obamacare.
26-year-olds are on their parents' policy. Support that?
Yeah, I think that what you really have to look at is decreasing the cost of health care. We have health care that
does this do it? Is what does the group take?
Well, I think that time will tell. We're not really exactly sure. We've got a couple of things in there. The Independent Payment Advisory Board. We're not exactly sure how that will decrease payments.
Okay.
The big if is, are we going to be able to actually decrease payments to doctors? The government's been trying to do that for years, and they haven't done. That's a big part of the savings of Obamacare. So I think the government makes up half of the healthcare system in this country as it is, right? A couple things that we don't do: we don't negotiate for prices. That would be a great thing in bringing down the cost of healthcare, and we overtreat people. And so we need to address a couple of those things.
Dan, did you like it, the mandatory part of this? I mean, that's what the Supreme Court came down, and that has a lot of millennials, a lot of people watching that are in their mid-20s or whatever, they decide not to have health insurance. I think they are stupid, but I think they have a constitutional right to be stupid and not get health insurance.
Well, I think health insurance is one of those special cases where we're not talking about, forcing someone to buy, milk at the grocery store. What we're talking about is really something that will be subsidized by all of us over time.
Right.
And so it made a lot of sense. And if anything, Obamacare didn't go far enough. We lost the public option. I think, most people of my age and the millennial generation would have said that we should have a more robust health care reform law. And so while the president's bill did a lot and got us a long way in terms of extending coverage, hopefully it'll do a lot in terms of controlling costs, and I think the CBO estimates do speak to that. But really, I don't think it went far enough.
So let me wrap up with you two guys tonight. I want to give the website by asking you a couple of predictions. Dan, let's start with you. Fiscal cliff, you say we come 40 days out. What happens?
I think if we're lucky, there won't be a deal, and they'll let this transpire, and then there will be a lot of political pressure to actually make a legislative move that makes sense. We can, start from scratch with the taxes and extend tax cuts for those who make less than $250,000 and let the rest expire. I think that is probably the most politically palatable.
Ryan, what happens? Prediction?
Well, I think, for the plug here, Congress kicks the can down the road. They're going to probably put in place a system that allows them to, in the first 6 months of next year, go towards a grand bargain debt deal where they can put everything on the table. I don't think they're going to have time to negotiate all that, but I think all those pieces need to be on the table. We're not going to solve this with just one piece here, tax reform here, healthcare here, Social Security. Everything's got to be there if we're going to get a bipartisan deal and get both sides to come together on this.
Final prediction, a tough one. Over/under figure, I set it at $20 trillion by the time President Obama's 4 years up in debt, which you would say, that's nothing.
Well, I would say that actually if we looked at the Simpson-Bowles Commission and the recommendations, the President and the Congress of 2010 have implemented many of their recommendations. In fact, 2/5 of the $1.5 trillion in savings that the Commission was recommending have been put in place. So, when we think about the interest savings from that alone is $250 billion that were saved based on the cuts that were already made. So I'm not going to give an over or under, but I would say that we've made progress. We've turned the economy around. We've addressed healthcare to an extent, and if we're lucky, in January we'll have a new bill that ends the tax cuts for the rich and extends it for those of us who make less than $250,000.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Dan. Ryan, thank you very much too, guys. Thanks for the debate tonight. Thanks for joining us. Coming up, I'm going to replay for you a bit of an interview I did with Governor Christie this week on my radio show. Things got a little bit difficult when I asked about the governor, about his embrace helping President Obama. We'll relive that next, and I'll give you my closing thoughts here on Dom Time.